Hello and welcome to our final episode of SJD Shorts. My name is Sanjoy Roy, I'm a dance writer for The Guardian, and over this series I've been joining choreographer Shobana on the stairs to talk about her works. Today on the stairs we are going to talk about a piece called Contagion from 2018. This is an unusually topical piece, in fact. It was it was commissioned by 1418 Now, which was a festival to commemorate the First World War. And Shobana, if I may say, rather typically took a bit of a sidelong angle to the war and focused instead on the Spanish flu pandemic that happened just as the war was ending. Of course, that makes it a very topical piece because we are now in another global pandemic caused by a virus. But before we talk about that, let me just ask Shobana how this piece on the flu virus came about.
Well, in my sort of research about the First World War, I think I was reading somewhere on the sort of medical advances that were made, and in particular about, the pioneering work on blood transfusion and blood banks, how they started in the First World War, which makes sense because obviously there were lots of wounded people to treat. So that kind of made me think about medical things, and I literally kind of bumped into the Spanish flu. And I think my first reaction was just one of astonishment that this amazing, huge effect that it had on the globe, from Fiji to the Arctic, wasn't really remembered or commemorated in the same way as the First World War. I mean, just to give you a little statistic, the First World War, the casualties was something like 20 million or 22 million. The Spanish flu pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people.
Okay, so that really is surprising. That it's astonishing, really, that the First World War is actually very present in our cultural memory, and the Spanish flu pandemic, given that it's on such a scale, we still think of it as an addendum to the First World War, a footnote or something. But actually, in terms of human impact, it was much more widespread, really. Amazing. Let me take you back to when I saw it at the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, when I saw the piece. I remember being struck by the thought that it was a companion piece to a piece you made called Too Mortal from 2012. And that's partly because they were both non-theatre pieces. They're both for an all-female cast. But really, the striking thing was that they both hinged on an idea of our mortality. Too Mortal was really looking at life's journey, so the mortality of the living, if you like, whereas I felt Contagion is looking at the mortality of the dying. It's about the body succumbing to death, in this case through illness. Can you tell us a bit more about how the choreography was affected by your research on this actual illness, the process of the illness?
Well, I was very, very lucky to be able to talk to a couple of brilliant virologists. The first person I spoke to was Professor Wendy Barclay. And as she was talking, I remember taking notes down furiously because she gave this incredibly dramatic account of how the virus enters our body. So she kind of described, like, when we sneeze or we cough, the virus very, very slowly floats down due to gravity. But then when we inhale it, the next thing it kind of feels is being buffeted about by the hairs on the surface of our cells, which have a kind of wave-like movement. Then it's incredibly strategic, and it enters our cells. And even though the cell is a very busy place with lots of stuff happening, it finds its way into the heart of the cell, the nucleus, and then proceeds to take over the machinery of the nucleus and then starts printing copies of itself. So it seemed to me it was like a cross between, one of those Cold War novels written by John le Carre and one of the Terminator films, because it was a fight for evolutionary survival. It's not an emotional fight, unlike the First World War, where people fought for territory or for politics, and it was a kind of more emotional engagement. Here it was a kind of a cold engagement between two entities who were, trying to overcome each other.
Yeah, so a story of infiltration and counter espionage or prevention, I guess. Yeah, it's also although the choreography itself reflects that process of the virus as it enters the cell. It's not just a choreographic piece; it's a very multimedia piece, which makes a lot of use of set and projection and light. Can you tell us why you felt the need to include these different media?
It's actually choreography in a way includes all those elements. Obviously choreographing dances is one part, but one also has to choreograph the whole staging. And the sort of very particular scientific narrative that Contagion had as one of its important sort of aspects really meant that I had to take the production sort of much wider. So it had to include dance as well as video projections, the set, which was inspired by photographs of wards which were just full of beds. So it was like a bit like a tsunami of beds coming at you. And of course, with the sound, we decided, since it was a public site-specific piece, that the audience would listen to it via headphones. And that would kind of give them a sort of a distant and yet sort of intimate experience of Contagion.
Yeah, it's also in terms of its timeline, I guess it also moves from a piece that looks more at the science into a much more humanistic focus on the people and their relationships to each other and their families. How did you make that transition of that kind of shift of focus?
That was one of the sort of challenges of Contagion for me. Is actually started off sort of deploying the dancers in a very abstract way to do with dynamics, and then very slowly shift them into being people, to represent people, nurses or caregivers. And actually I used text, in fact, original letters and diary entries from the time to do that. And one of the things that really sort of influenced me was the conversation I had with another amazing virologist, who's actually one of the world's expert on the Spanish flu, Professor John Oxford. Because when I went to see him, in my mind, I had thought, oh, this is going to be a very dark piece. Surely with 50 million dead, can't be anything else. But he completely changed my thinking by pointing out how actually, rather than seeing this episode as one of victims, it was also an episode of incredible human resilience and care, as people gave nursing, they cared devotedly and with loads of commitment to their family members, to their community and their neighbors. And of course, the caregiving was done primarily by women, sisters, wives, mothers. And I remember reading this brilliant book by Laura Spinney called The Pale Rider, which made me really understand, because it highlighted why the story of the Spanish flu pandemic is really a narrative of women's memories and writings and deeds.
Yes. So perhaps we can think of this not as a story of victims, but of unsung heroes, a tribute to heroes. Perhaps a little like we're re-echoing today an awareness of care workers, the work that they're doing today. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the film. I'll just say, echoing Shobana's point about listening, it's a much better experience if you are able to watch the film using headphones or earphones. Really, I remember it very well in the performance. It really gives a sense that although we're jointly watching this, there's also quite a personal experience to the interaction there. So I recommend headphones or earphones if you can. Let's take a look at it now.
the outbreak, it was most difficult to persuade those who had not yet seen other cases that the condition was not ordinary pneumonia. The physical signs were most variable. In most cases, the patient had been ill for a day or two, 36 or 48 hours. Due to the very virulent microbic toxemia, the patient generally began to complain in some way of his chest, often of pain in one side or other of the thorax. There was also cough, short, dry, and hacking to begin with, looser and associated with frothy or blood-stained or purulent. The rate of breathing became accelerated out of all proportion to the physical signs, and yet without any particular dry and pungent. Quite as often, the whole of the patient's body and limbs would be covered with profuse flushed and red, with a peculiar drooping of the eyelids giving a weary look, rapidly changed to one of progressive cyanosis. It was then that one knew that the prognosis had now altered so completely that the patient was almost certain, almost uniform certainty, by reason of their colour alone. The whole face, and particularly the lips and ears, passed through the stages of dark red to purplish red to reddish purple to absolute purple, of dark red epistaxis to purplish nosebleed to reddish purple, of dark red was also purplish red, with the expectoration of bright red liquid blood in amounts varying from half a teaspoonful to several ounces. If blood was vomited at all, it was just so small. Delirium and coma occurred often enough amongst the bad cases. When delirium did occur, it was of the noisy, trembling, shouting out, the low, muttering, restless type, the patient picking at the bedclothes or at objects round about him, with head thrown back, mouth half open, mouth half open, mouth half open. A dreadful sight.
I was very ill. I do remember being covered with a linseed meal poultice over the entire front of my body, from my throat to the bottom of my stomach, and pleading with Mum to take it off, and her placing her hand gently on my chest and saying, "Just a few more minutes, love." Then I was dried and I was gently turned on my face, and another poultice applied, completely covering my back. I don't know how many days and nights this was kept up. Dr. Hume told Mum it was due to her splendid and constant nursing that we all got over it. And she sat up during the nights to give us our medicine and kept the fire going. And she had to do it all by herself.
There wasn't a sound in the village. The silence was to be broken only by the screeching of owls, which until then had been unknown there, and now mysteriously appeared in the rooms of the dying at night.
Organized a procession at night, which was led by Father Abranches Martins. It went around the whole village. Although there was no electric light in those days, there were so many candles and lanterns that the village was bathed in a sea of light that night.
That film was made in 2018, and it's a strange feeling to look back on it and at the same time feel how completely relevant it is to this very moment that we're living in 2 years later, in another global pandemic caused by a virus. It's almost a strange combination of foresight and hindsight, or double vision. I'm not really sure. How do you feel about rewatching it now in 2020, Shobana?
Well, I must admit I became a bit obsessed with the Spanish flu pandemic. Becoming a bit like sort of a dinner party bore on the subject, and my favorite bedtime reading for a long time was the virology textbook. But of course, researching it is a totally different experience to living in the middle of a pandemic and seeing the devastation it's causing. Actually, what struck me most was the similarities, because when a virus mutates slowly, as it normally does, we have a chance to sort of develop immunity. But when it has this dramatic shift, which happens once in a while, and suddenly a totally new virus hits our systems, and we really are totally helpless. And so now as then, the only thing that we can offer is, again, love, care, dedicated nursing, and alleviating symptoms. And I guess, we have to go through this till either us or the virus declares a truce. And I'm hoping that will happen very soon.
Me too, for sure. And I'd also like to say how much it struck me, what you said about John Oxford pointing out that the Spanish flu pandemic is really, we can see it as a tribute to human care, particularly female care, and empathy and community, really. So I'm hoping that this piece also gives us not only a reflection on the past, but perhaps some inspiration as well for the future. Mm. Well, that is the last time we meet on the stairs, at least for this series. Can I say it's been a pleasure not only to watch, but also to consider these works alongside you, Shobana, on the stairs, and also viewers at home. If viewers at home would like to find out more about Shobana's work, I really recommend listening to the Surface Tension podcast, which gives you all kinds of angles from South Asian street slang to musical composition to science fiction, all different angles that you might not expect always to be in a program about dance. You can find that podcast on the Shobana Jayasingh Dance channel on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. So thanks to all of you once again for joining us on the stairs. Shobana, any word from your step?
Well, first of all, to thank you, Sanjoy, so much for being with me during this program. And it's always lovely to talk to you on matters of dance. And a special thank you to all the dancers whom we've seen crossing our screens. And it was wonderful working with each and every one of them. And I'm really hoping that very soon I'll be working with those dancers back in the studio. And also obviously to the designers and the production teams who made these dance works that we've been watching possible. And lastly, to all of you who watched the series, who commented and who liked us and who shared, thank you so very much, and hope to see you again soon.